Chapter 2 of the Africa Economic Outlook 2022 is about climate resilience. And it's discussing the nexus between climate resilience and growth in Africa. And one of the main findings of the chapter is that Africa is the least resilient region of the world and one of the most vulnerable regions in terms of climate shocks. And climate change is really imposing huge economic and social costs to the continent because it slows down economic growth, it increases mortality, it exacerbates conflicts over land and scarce natural resources, including water resources, but it also induces youth migration. And yet, Africa is at the receiving end of climate change, despite its low contribution to the global carbon emissions. If you look at the 170 years in the past, over which we have data on carbon emissions, Africa's contribution to global carbon emissions is just below 3%, much of which is either locked in forestry or land use. But when you compare with advanced and emerging economies, they account for about 70% of global carbon emissions, depleting about 85% of carbon budget of the world, with only 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent left if the net zero target is to be reached by 2050. The average American had a carbon footprint of 14 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is about 15 times more than an average African, who has just 0.95 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent in terms of carbon footprint, which is far below the 2%, the 2 tons of carbon equivalent, which is required at a global average. So if we consider the cumulative global carbon emissions that has spurred economic growth in developing countries and the remaining emissions which could help limit the temperature increases above 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2050, then Africa is owed up to 4.8 trillion US dollars in terms of carbon budget allocation. So this means that Africa still has sufficient headroom to grow within the limit of the global carbon budget. And therefore, in terms of climate justice, Africa should be allowed to grow too and should be allowed to leverage its resources, either in terms of renewable or non-renewable energy in order to grow.